When Mason opened the front door, he expected the familiar rhythm of his life. The faint hum of the fridge, the soft clink of Megan's mug waiting to be rinsed, the coconut creamer smell that lingered like her second perfume. What he found instead was silence. Heavy, deliberate silence, broken only by the sight of a folded note pinned under a small silver key. It wasn't their house key. It was her gym locker key, the one she'd used religiously every morning before work. A token of habit, of routine, of control. Now it sat there on the oak table like evidence in a case he hadn't known he was prosecuting. He stared at it, the paper trembling slightly from the draft of the open door. He didn't pick it up right away. He noticed the other details first. The creamer bottle still uncapped on the counter. A half ring of coffee on the sink where her mug had sat that morning. Her favorite jacket is missing from the hook by the door. Her sneakers, the old pair with the worn soles, left behind like an afterthought. Contradiction. She'd taken the things that mattered to her comfort, but left behind the scraps that had shaped their shared life. Finally, Mason unfolded the note. The words were neat, controlled, the kind of handwriting Megan had always been proud of. I need space. Don't contact me. This is better for both of us. No signature. No apology. No explanation. Mason read it twice, then set it back down exactly where it had been, the gym key pressing against the paper. He didn't shout. He didn't call her name. He didn't pace the room or reach for the phone. Instead, he leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, staring at the empty hallway that had once echoed with her voice. The anger came slowly, not like fire but like iron heating in a forge. Controlled, steady, ready to be shaped. He thought of the years he'd put into this house, every nail he'd hammered, every bill he'd paid on time. He thought of how Megan had once said she admired his steadiness, how she'd toasted him for always showing up. Now she'd vanished without warning, as if his presence had become disposable. His jaw tightened, but he stayed still. Falling apart would give her too much credit. She wanted space? She'd get it, more than she bargained for. The house smelled like her, but Mason already felt the air shifting, like it belonged to him alone now. He noticed the faint tick of the clock above the fridge, the scrape of his boots on the tile as he finally pushed off the counter. He collected the note and key, slid them into a drawer, and shut it with finality. Then he walked room to room, not searching for her, but cataloging the absence she thought would cripple him. The closet is half empty. The bathroom shelf was stripped of her creams and lotions. The bed with only one pillow was left warm. He took it all in without flinching. By the time he circled back to the kitchen, Mason knew one thing. The game had already changed. He hadn't asked for it, but he sure as hell wouldn't play it on her terms. He sat down at the table where the note had been, pulled out a pad of paper and began to write. Not a plea, not a response, but a list. Bank, lawyer, locks, camper. Each line was a step, each step a way forward. The silence around him no longer felt heavy. Felt like space, his space, and Mason wasn't about to waste it. By morning, Mason's list was already in motion. He didn't call Megan, didn't send a message asking why. Instead, he called a lawyer. Not just any name from the phone book. He called an old recommendation from a buddy who'd gone through a nasty split years back. The man's name was David Shaw, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who didn't waste words. Shaw Law, the voice answered. This is Mason Cole, he said, calm, steady. My wife walked out last night, left a note. I need to freeze the accounts and start protecting what's mine. There was a pause on the other end. Then Shaw's voice sharpened. You're not the first man to call me like this. Can you come in tomorrow morning? I'll be there, Mason said, then hung up. No questions about Megan. No wandering down memory lane. Just the next step forward. After that, he called the bank, moving quickly and deliberately, shutting down the joint credit cards, putting freezes where they mattered. Megan wanted space. She could pay for it herself. By noon, Mason had hooked his camper to the back of his truck. The drive to Lake Hartwell wasn't long, but the road felt like a transition, each mile pulling him away from the life Megan thought she'd shattered. The air grew clearer, the noise of the city fading, until all that was left was the open road and the steady hum of the tires beneath him. At the lake, Mason parked the camper in a quiet spot, backed up to the water. He sat in the folding chair he'd bought years ago for fishing trips Megan had never cared to join. The lake stretched wide and still, broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish or the call of a bird across the water. He cracked open a beer and let the silence do its work. By the second day, the texts started. First from Megan's friends, short, clipped messages dripping with faux concern. She just needs time. Don't overreact. She'll come around. He ignored them. They were playing messenger for a woman who hadn't even had the decency to face him. By the third day, Megan's own number lit up his phone. First, it was casual. Just checking in. Hope you're okay. Then it shifted. We should talk. This isn't what I meant. Finally, by the end of the week, the messages turned frantic. Why are you shutting me out? Why are you freezing the accounts? We need to work this out. Mason read them, then set the phone face down on the armrest. He didn't block her. He didn't respond. Let her feel the weight of her own words. I need space. Don't contact me. He was only giving her what she demanded. The longer he sat by that lake, the more the knots in his chest loosened. He wasn't running from the pain, but he wasn't drowning in it either. The stillness gave him room to think, to remember who he was without her shadow hovering over him. He'd built things with his hands. He'd fixed what was broken. He'd never quit on anything worth keeping. And now Megan had chosen to walk away. Each night, Mason made a small fire by the water, listening to the crackle of wood and the low hum of crickets. He slept better than he had in years, the kind of deep, unbroken sleep that comes when you know you've taken control. On the seventh morning, he woke to another flood of texts. This time, the tone was different. Less frantic, more angry. You can't just ignore me. You don't get to make these decisions without me. We'll see what the lawyers say. Mason smiled, slow and steady. Let her lawyer talk. Let the world spin. He had already chosen his ground, and he wasn't about to leave it. The lake had given him what he needed: clarity, calm, and proof that silence wasn't weakness. It was power. He packed up the camper, hitched it back to the truck, and started the engine. Tomorrow he'd sit across from David Shaw and make the next move. Megan had started this game with a key on the table. Mason was going to finish it with the door locked tight behind her. The morning Mason returned from the lake, the sky over town was a heavy gray, the kind that promised rain without hurry. He parked his truck near the lawyer's office, the courthouse dome looming a few blocks away. As he stepped out, adjusting his jacket, he noticed a figure pacing on the sidewalk ahead. Megan, her hair, once styled with the same precision as her neat handwriting, hung loose and unkempt. Her face looked drawn, shadows under her eyes. She wasn't the confident woman who'd toasted fresh starts over wine. She looked like someone who hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't found the freedom she thought she'd chased. Mason, she said, her voice already trembling. We need to talk. He stopped a few feet short of her. Calm, steady. About what? Her eyes darted, searching his face for cracks. About everything. That note, it was a mistake. I was overwhelmed. I didn't mean for it to come out like that. I just needed a break. I didn't mean to, she trailed off, shaking her head. Mason let the silence stretch between them, the steady rhythm of traffic and footsteps filling the gap. He thought of the note again, those 4 sentences written without hesitation, pressed under that damn key. A mistake doesn't look like that. You said you needed space, Mason replied finally. His tone wasn't sharp, it was level, the kind of voice that left no room for argument. I gave you space. Her face twisted, frustration bubbling. Don't twist this. I didn't mean forever. I didn't mean for you to. He cut her off, eyes steady on hers. You wrote it, Megan. You made your choice. For a moment she looked small, almost childlike, but then her pride surged back. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Mason, please. We can fix this. We don't have to go through lawyers. We don't have to freeze accounts. You don't have to make it ugly. Mason glanced at the door to the law office behind her, then back to her. I'm not making it ugly. I'm making it clear. The words landed, heavy as stone. Megan's composure cracked, her eyes filling with panic. So that's it? You're just done? After everything? You were done first, he said. I'm just catching up. For a moment, he thought she might cry right there on the sidewalk. Instead, she clenched her jaw, turned on her heel, and shoved through the office door, muttering something about answers and fairness. Mason stayed where he was, hands in his jacket pockets, watching her storm inside. He didn't need to follow. Let her rant to the receptionist. Let her demand explanations from people who owed her none. The law would speak louder than any words he could give her now. He leaned against the wall, the cool brick steady at his back, and let the rain start to fall in light drops around him. People hurried past with umbrellas, some giving him curious glances, others ignoring him completely. Mason didn't care. Minutes later, the glass door swung open again. Megan emerged, face tight, jaw set. She didn't look at him as she strode past, heels clicking sharp on the wet sidewalk. Mason didn't turn to watch her go. Instead, he pushed off the wall and walked inside to meet Shaw, his steps slow, deliberate. By the time he sat across from his lawyer, Mason felt nothing but resolve. Megan could cry, plead, twist words however she wanted, but she couldn't undo the truth. She'd left. She'd written it down in her own hand, and now she had to live with it. Shaw glanced at the folder on his desk. Are you ready to get started? Mason nodded once. I was ready the moment she put that key on the table. It was a Saturday afternoon when Mason heard the knock. Not a polite knock. Not the hesitant kind you'd expect from someone asking permission. This was sharp, deliberate, like whoever stood outside thought they had a right to be there. Mason opened the door. Megan stood on the porch, arms folded tight across her chest, eyes darting like she wasn't sure she wanted to be there. Beside her was Kyle. Mason had seen him around before, at the gym once or twice, in town maybe. He was younger, hair trimmed close, the type who carried himself with the false swagger of someone who thought muscles meant authority. Today, Kyle wore a smirk that didn't match the nervous way he shifted his weight. Mason, Megan started, her voice low, we're just here to get some of my things. It'll only take a minute. Mason leaned against the doorframe, unmoved. No. Kyle's smirk widened, as if Mason had just confirmed some private bet. Come on, man. Don't make this harder than it has to be. She just needs her stuff. We'll be out of your hair in no time. Mason's eyes cut to Kyle, steady and cold. Her stuff goes through the lawyers. That's the deal. You don't walk in here. Kyle stepped forward, puffing his chest. Look, I get you're pissed, but you can't stop her from taking what's hers. This was her house too. Mason didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift his weight. He just stared at Kyle with the kind of silence that strips away bravado. It was, he said. Not anymore. Megan flinched, looking down at her shoes. She hadn't expected this wall of resistance. Not from the man she used to accuse of being too steady, too predictable. Kyle, though, wasn't quick enough to read the room. You really think you can just... Mason cut him off with a slight shake of his head. I don't think so. I know. Everything goes through the lawyers. That's final. The porch fell silent. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the gutter, the only sound between them. Mason could see the shift happen in Kyle's face. The smirk slipping, the confidence draining. He wasn't dealing with a man ready to negotiate. He was facing a man who'd already decided. Megan finally spoke, her voice small. Mason, please, just let me get a few things. Clothes, maybe my laptop. Mason's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. You made your choice, Megan. You don't get to stroll back in like nothing happened. You don't live here anymore. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't argue. Kyle, though, tried one last push, squaring his shoulders. You think you're scaring me? You can't keep this up forever. Mason stepped forward just enough that Kyle had to tilt his chin back to meet his eyes. His voice dropped, firm and even. This isn't about scaring you. This is about boundaries. You don't cross this door again. Not today, not ever. Kyle's jaw worked, but no words came out. The false confidence had bled out of him completely. Megan tugged at his arm, whispering something Mason didn't bother to catch. Together, they backed off the porch, Kyle throwing one last look over his shoulder that was more wounded than threatening. Mason closed the door slowly, the latch clicking into place like a judge's gavel. He stood for a moment in the quiet, listening to their footsteps fade down the walk. The house felt different afterward, lighter, safer. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about rage. It was about control. Mason had drawn the line, and they had learned what it meant. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat at the table. The silence was his again, not theirs. And in that silence, he felt the strength of knowing he hadn't wavered. Not once. The house was quiet again, but Mason knew quiet didn't mean safe. Not anymore. After Megan and Kyle had walked off his porch, something lingered. The sense that this wasn't over, that they'd try again through other angles. He wasn't going to sit blind, waiting for the next ambush. That night, Mason sat down at the desk in the spare room where their old home computer still sat. It was the same computer Megan had insisted on keeping even after they both had laptops, claiming she liked the big screen for checking emails and shopping. He'd barely touched it in months. Now he powered it up, listening to the faint whir of the fan, the glow of the screen rising in the darkened room. He started with the email account they had once shared. Her name was still logged in, her inbox wide open. At first, it was nothing unusual, receipts, newsletters, the usual clutter. But Mason knew where to look. He clicked into the archive, into folders that weren't obvious, into the trash where most people thought secrets went to die. What he found wasn't one mistake. It wasn't one bad decision made in the heat of the moment. It was months. Email threads with Kyle, each message sharp with flirtation, then sliding into intimacy. Attachments of hotel reservations, receipts for dinners she claimed had been work functions. Mason scrolled through the words, not skimming but reading every line, letting each one settle like a nail in a coffin. He found jokes at his expense. Lines where Megan mocked his routines, his steady habits, the same traits she'd once praised. He's so predictable, it's almost boring. Kyle had replied with laughing emojis, calling Mason old school, saying Megan deserved excitement. Mason sat back in the chair, staring at the screen. Anger rose, but it wasn't a wildfire. It was the steady burn of coal in a furnace, a heat he could use. There were no tears, no outbursts, just the steady acknowledgement of truth. He clicked through more folders, photos exchanged between them, calendar invites disguised as work meetings, even a separate email chain where Megan had laid out a plan to ease Mason out, once she and Kyle figured out their next steps. It was all there in black and white. Mason opened a fresh folder on the desktop, naming it simply Proof. He dragged every email, every receipt, every picture into it. He exported the chat logs from a messaging app she hadn't bothered to log out of, saving them to a flash drive. Each file was like a brick stacked neatly, methodically, into a wall she would never climb over again. When the drive was full, Mason sat still for a moment, the glow of the monitor lighting his face. He didn't feel broken. He felt confirmed. The gut instinct that had whispered something was wrong now stood tall with evidence. He opened his email and composed a single message to Shaw, his lawyer. No long explanation, no emotional rant. Just the facts. Attached files, labeled clearly, dates and receipts aligned. His message was one line. This should cover everything we need. He clicked send. Leaning back in his chair, Mason let the silence wash over him again. The betrayal wasn't a mystery anymore. It wasn't an unknown shadow. It was a documented fact, time-stamped and undeniable. And that made it easier to carry. The computer screen dimmed as the system went idle, reflecting his face back at him in faint blue. He didn't look like a man crushed by his wife's choices. He looked like a man sharpening his tools, preparing for the final cut. He stood, pulled the flash drive from the port, and slipped it into his pocket. The house around him was still half empty where Megan had stripped it of her favorite things, but now it felt solid again, like it had chosen sides. By the time Mason turned off the light and closed the door behind him, The fury had settled into something stronger. Resolve. The folder of evidence sat on Shaw's desk like a loaded weapon. Emails, receipts, hotel bills. Months of betrayal neatly stacked in black and white. Mason had delivered it without ceremony, just sliding the flash drive across the polished wood. Shaw had barely raised an eyebrow as he plugged it in, scrolling through the contents. "This," Shaw muttered, "is ironclad. She won't be able to spin her way out of it." Mason nodded once. Good. The next step was simple but decisive. Using Megan's own abandonment note, the one pinned under her gym key, Shaw filed paperwork transferring the lease fully into Mason's name. She had walked away, written her intentions in her own hand. That note wasn't just a goodbye. It was a legal surrender. Days later, the confirmation came through. Mason was sole tenant, sole resident. The house was his. The locks, the walls, the space he had built. It all belonged to him alone. The first call came that night. Megan's number lit up the screen, and for once Mason answered. "You can't do this," she snapped before he even said hello. Her voice was tight, panicked. "That's still my home. You don't get to just erase me from it." Mason sat in his chair, voice steady. "You left, Megan, in writing. That note is all the erasing I needed." "That wasn't," she choked, scrambling for words. "It wasn't supposed to be permanent. I was overwhelmed. I just needed some time to breathe." He almost laughed, but didn't. "Then you should have said that. Instead, you said you needed space and I gave you space. You don't get to rewrite it now." Her voice rose, anger masking desperation. "So what, you're just going to slam the door in my face? After everything we've built?" Mason's jaw tightened, but he kept calm. "You made that choice the moment you walked out. All I did was sign the paperwork you left behind." Silence stretched on the line, broken only by her uneven breathing. He could almost see her face, twisted between fury and fear, realizing that this time her words had weight she couldn't wiggle free from. "You're not even human," she finally spat. "Who does this without even talking it through?" Mason leaned back in his chair, eyes on the ceiling. "The man you thought was predictable. Turns out he was just patient. Don't mistake one for the other." She hung up on him, but the call left Mason lighter, not heavier. He knew what would come next. More calls, more anger, maybe even threats through her lawyer, but it didn't matter. The paperwork was signed. The house was his. Later that week, Shaw confirmed what Mason already knew. "She has no legal right to re-enter the property. If she tries, you call the cops. Don't engage. You've got the law on your side now." Mason thanked him, then drove home. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw the porch light he'd replaced last summer glowing steady, illuminating the front door. For the first time since Megan had walked out, the house didn't feel half empty. It felt whole again because it was his entirely. That night, Mason poured himself a glass of whiskey and walked the perimeter of the property. The grass, the fence, the tools in the shed. It all stood quietly under the stars, answering only to him now. He felt no rush of triumph, no need to gloat, just the quiet strength of knowing he'd drawn the line and defended it. When he went inside, he locked the door behind him, not out of fear but out of choice. The lock clicked, final and steady, like the last piece of a puzzle sliding into place. The weeks that followed felt quieter than Mason expected. He went to work, came home, ate his meals at the same table where Megan had left her note. Life moved forward in straight lines, steady and predictable. But in the background, whispers spread. He didn't chase them, he didn't need to. Word travels fast in a town where everyone knows everyone. First came the murmurs at his job site. A coworker mentioned seeing Megan and Kyle arguing outside the gym, her voice sharp enough to turn heads in the parking lot. Then another buddy mentioned Kyle's wife. Yes, Kyle had a wife of his own, had found out. She'd stormed into Kyle's workplace, shouting loud enough for half the office to hear. By the end of that week, Mason didn't have to ask questions. The stories found him. Kyle's marriage was in tatters. His kids had been pulled out of a soccer game early when the tension boiled over on the sidelines. Megan's job at the wellness center suddenly looked shaky. Clients didn't like drama, and the rumor mill was merciless. Mason listened, nodded, and went back to work. He didn't add fuel. He didn't offer his version. He stayed silent, and his silence spoke louder than any defense. At the grocery store one evening, he passed two women whispering near the produce section. He caught fragments. Left him for Kyle. Can you believe she thought she'd get away with it? When they noticed him, their voices dropped, eyes flicking down to the apples in their hands. Mason didn't break stride. He didn't need to. For Megan and Kyle, the fallout was public and messy. For Mason, it was private and calm. He spent his evenings on small projects, tightening the fence, oiling the hinges on the shed, repainting the back deck. Every stroke of the brush, every turn of the wrench, reminded him that his life wasn't collapsing. It was steadying. One night, an old friend stopped by, dropping a six-pack on the table. "Heard the whole mess," the friend said. "You holding up?" Mason cracked a bottle, passed it across. "Better than they are." The friend chuckled, shaking his head. "That's the truth. People are saying Kyle looks like hell. And Megan, well, she's not exactly winning any sympathy." Mason shrugged. "Not my business anymore." And that was the difference. For them, the fallout was fire, gossip, and sleepless nights. For him, it was quiet evenings on his porch, the cicadas buzzing, the house steady under his name. He didn't have to lift a finger. Their world was burning itself down without him touching a match. By the end of the month, Megan had stopped calling. Kyle's name was dirt around town. Mason didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. He just kept moving, the silence of his own life louder than their noise. Mason had expected it. Silence never lasted forever when lawyers were involved. The letter came in a thin white envelope, slipped through the slot one Thursday morning. He slid it open with his pocket knife at the kitchen table. Inside, a polished letter from Megan's attorney, full of careful language. It argued she was entitled to a fair share of the lease deposit and remaining savings, and that her contributions over the years should not be ignored. The tone was professional, but Mason could feel the fingerprints of Megan and Kyle all over it. He read it twice, folded it neatly, and set it aside. He didn't call Shaw immediately. He didn't rage. He poured himself a coffee, stirred in a splash of milk, and let the steam rise as he thought. By afternoon, Shaw called him first. "Got the letter?" "Yeah. She wants to claw back what she thinks she's owed," Shaw said. "But with the abandonment note, her case is thin. Very thin." Mason nodded. "Let her try." That night, Mason got an email from Walter, an old coworker who'd always had his back. Walter's note was short, blunt. "You need to see this." Attached was a file of screenshots. Mason opened it. There they were, messages between Megan and Kyle, their names lit up at the top of each bubble. They weren't just scheming about running off together. They were plotting to manipulate him. "If we push him through the lawyer, he'll cave," Megan had typed. "He won't want the hassle," Kyle replied. "He's predictable. We'll get the money without a fight." Predictable. The same word they'd mocked him with in those emails. The same word Kyle had thrown around like an insult. Mason leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen reflecting off his calm face. They thought he was soft. They thought his silence meant weakness. They still hadn't learned the difference between patience and surrender. He saved the screenshots, attached them to a reply, and sent them straight to Shaw. No commentary, just proof. The next morning, Shaw called again, and Mason could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "This kills her case. They weren't just asking for a settlement. They were conspiring to defraud you. We'll file this as evidence if they push forward." "Good," Mason said simply. A week later, Megan's lawyer reached out again. But this time the tone was different. No more demands, no more talk of fairness. Just a terse acknowledgement that her client was withdrawing her request. Mason didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. The silence afterward was its own reward. That evening, he walked out onto the porch, sat in his chair, and let the cool night air wash over him. Across the street, the world carried on. Kids rode bikes, a neighbor mowed his lawn, a dog barked at nothing. normal life, and that was exactly what Megan and Kyle no longer had. Mason sipped his coffee and thought about the word Kyle had used. Predictable. Maybe to them that meant boring, easy to push around. But to Mason it meant steady, reliable, the kind of man who didn't fold when pressure came, who didn't let panic dictate his choices. They had mistaken restraint for weakness, and now they were living with the cost of that mistake. When the phone buzzed on the table, Mason glanced at it. Shaw had sent a short text. "It's done. You're in the clear. They've got nothing left to stand on." Mason typed back one word. "Good." Then he put the phone down and went inside, shutting the door with the quiet finality of a man who didn't need revenge to win. All he needed was the truth. Months passed. The court filings, the evidence, the shouting matches through lawyers, it was all over now. Mason had the papers to prove it. The lease was his, the savings intact, the house untouched by anyone but him. Megan had walked away, and the law had slammed the door shut behind her. She was left with nothing but regret. Mason didn't need to imagine it. He heard enough through whispers at the diner, from friends who couldn't help but mention how she looked these days, thin, tired, burned out from a fire she'd lit herself. Kyle was gone too, his marriage in ruins, his job hanging by a thread. They'd burned their bridges for each other, and now they were standing in the ash. Mason, meanwhile, lived quietly. He replaced the curtains, painted the walls, fixed the squeaky hinge on the back door. The house stopped feeling like a battlefield and started feeling like his again. Solid, simple, steady. He didn't rush to fill it with noise. He didn't chase distractions. He let the quiet be his companion. One evening, after a long day at work, Mason sat down with a cold beer and opened his phone. A notification popped up. "Your Spotify password has been changed." For a second, he just stared at it. Then he almost laughed. Out of everything Megan had lost, out of everything she'd burned through, she still thought she had the right to reach back into his life through something as small as a playlist. Music they'd once shared, songs tied to memories she didn't deserve anymore. He didn't hesitate. He opened the account settings, changed the password again, and this time removed every connected device that wasn't his. Each click was like cutting a string. One more tie severed, one more thread she couldn't tug. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair, the silence of the house steady around him. That was the last of it. No more notes on the table. No more frantic calls. No more whispers of what she wanted, what she thought she deserved. He poured the rest of his beer into the sink, washed the bottle, and set it aside. Then he picked up a roller and went back to painting the living room wall. A clean coat of gray covering the old beige Megan had chosen years ago. With every stroke, the past faded, replaced by something sharp and new. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't hate. It was a reclamation. When the paint dried, Mason sat on the couch, looking at the wall, listening to the steady hum of the house that was finally, fully his. He felt no emptiness, only peace.
Subscribe and stay one step ahead of cheaters. And trust me, the next story makes this one look like a fairy tale.